From the Pension Lawyers Association of South Africa. Thank you so much for joining us. We are expecting a few more people to join, and I'm sure they'll do that while introducing speakers and just doing the introductions. So I'm Leanne van Wyk, and I'm going to introduce our speakers today, Chantal and Amina. Chantal is up first. Amina will join us in a few minutes. Chantal Manson, who you can see on screen now, heads up the legal, regulatory and advocacy team within the group legal department at Liberty. Chantal is an admitted attorney, and she is also our current president of the Pension Lawyers Association of South Africa. So welcome, Chantal, and we're looking forward to what you have to say. Thank you very much. And then also speaking today is Amina Yuda. Amina is a banking and financial services lawyer at Norton Rose Fulbright, and she is involved mainly with the financial sector legislation and regulation, as well as litigation and dispute resolution matters. So today we are discussing the Conduct of Financial Institutions Bill, or COFI, and in particular the second draft of the bill, which was issued recently. So what we're going to do is just spend some time discussing the general principles around COFI, and then we're going to focus in on the changes from the first draft to the second draft of COFI. In addition, in this draft of COFI, there was a very large amendment to the Pension Funds Act. So we're also going to spend some time focusing in on that amendment. Just to let you know, we will make the slides available after the webinar, so you don't need to make crazy notes. We will give you the slides. And at the end of the webinar, Amina and Chantal will take a few questions. They'll pick and choose what they would like to answer. So again, welcome and thank you so much for joining us. And I'm going to hand over to Chantal.
Thank you very much, Leanne, and morning, everyone. I hope everyone is safe and still surviving this crazy time we find ourselves in. And notwithstanding all the challenges we're facing, our regulators and authorities are still keeping us very, very busy. So we're very grateful to see the second draft of the COFI bill that was published recently. As Leanne said, there's a few items we're going to be taking you through. And thankfully, we got this bill prior to December, so we've got time now to actually unpack it and apply our minds. Unfortunately, there was a very short time in which to make submissions. So we've all been working quite furiously to go through this together with all the consequential amendments that were accompanied with the second version of this bill. But hopefully today we can shed some light on where this bill and framework is landing and what it means for us in our industry. So just to quickly recap this whole Twin Peaks regime and model that we find ourselves in. Back in April 2018, we saw the Financial Sector Regulations Act come into effect. This is what we call a regulator-facing piece of legislation, which sets out the regulatory architecture that established the Prudential Authority. And the Prudential Authority is obviously looking after all the prudential matters, the financial soundness matters, and systemic matters that impact the financial services sector. And they primarily still are responsible for the insurers, and the banks, together with the SARB legislation. But as much as the PA is currently only looking after certain types of financial institutions, the intention is still for the PA to be the primary prudential regulator or authority for all types of financial institutions. However, we're still waiting to see exactly how that will unfold for the retirement fund sector, because they recently published a gazette further extending the delegation from the PA to the FECA in terms of prudential regulations for retirement funds, CISs and friendly societies up until March 2024. Initially, that was only up until March next year, but they're still busy unpacking exactly how this is going to be sitting. So what we're looking at today is the COFI bill. And the COFI bill is what is seen as a financial institution-facing piece of legislation. So the FSR Act is what created the PA, the FECA. It sets out their mandates, it sets out their powers, their objectives. It also sets out all the enforcement tools and mechanisms that they have in their toolbox in terms of supervising and being proactive, intensive, and intrusive in terms of how they actually regulate the financial services sector. COFI, on the other hand, is what is important for us because this is the financial institution facing piece of legislation. So financial institutions is very, very broad. I mean, it extends to banks, retirement funds, insurers, FSPs, CISs, and so forth. So this is, the COFI bill is setting out how financial institutions are expected to conduct themselves when dealing with financial customers and what outcomes are they meant to be achieving or delivering on for their financial customers. So I'm going to get into the detail just now, but this picture is just trying to depict currently there are over 13 financial sector laws, each with its own market conduct regulations. Sometimes there are varying or different requirements from a market conduct point of view, depending on which type of financial institution you're dealing with. And what COFI is wanting to achieve is to harmonize this. So COFI is going to be the new legal framework that is streamlining the market conduct regulation across the South African financial services sector to make sure that there is a consistent approach in terms of how financial institutions conduct themselves when dealing with financial customers. And yes, there will be certain instances where the expectations of financial institutions will differ because your customers do differ and the products do differ and the activities do differ. But essentially what COFI is wanting to do is set at a very high level a framework in terms of what the outcomes are or what's expected from financial institutions. And this framework is now embedding the TCF principles. So we all know TCF's been around for quite some time. We all know back in the day when it was first published, it wasn't law, it was just spoken about, it was in papers. But what COFI is doing is now actually entrenching the 6 TCF outcomes into the bill and creating a framework around those 6 TCF outcomes, which essentially means it's now going to be law, it's going to be legislation, which means it's going to be binding on all financial institutions. And the reason for doing this is that they want to strengthen consumer protection within our South African context. And in order to do so, there needs to be a single comprehensive market conduct framework that's in place and that's applied consistently, irrespective of which type of financial institution you are and irrespective of which type of activity, product, or financial service you are actually rendering. In addition, it's also written in such a way that there is flexibility available to the authority when setting out the detail on exactly how COFI will apply to the different types of financial institutions to in order or to enable the FSCA to allow for new entrants into the market to try and address barriers to entry, because sometimes, you know, it might seem very overwhelming, all the regulatory requirements that are required from a financial institution, that it might be seen as prohibitive. So there is the ability, or the FSCA is empowered to apply COFI in a more proportional manner, depending on the size of the financial institution, the risk that the financial institution might be posing, what types of products and services they'll be offering. And then also very key and what's very relevant for us in the South African context is transformation and financial inclusion. Recently, with the midterm budget speech, there was a policy paper published by Treasury dealing with their thoughts on financial inclusion. So we know that this is very top of mind for us in South Africa. We've seen it written into the FSR Act. It's also a very key theme that's been driven in the COFI bill as well, which I'll get into details later on. And then lastly, also COFI is there to also enable competition and innovation. In the response document with the second draft of the bill, there was also a whole write-up on cryptocurrency or crypto assets, and you know, that the FSCA together with the PA and National Treasury are still trying to unpack exactly how should these new forms of financial products or services be regulated, and how can the regulation also enable innovation and support competition. So just to recap, COFI is going to be activity-based. This means that if you are performing any of the activities listed in Schedule 1, you will be required to obtain a COFI license for that activity. You can't perform that activity unless you've got the COFI license. In certain instances, there is dual licensing required with other financial sector law, but I'll speak to that later. What's also very important to remember is that COFI is principle-based. It's a framework. It's setting out at a very high level what the expectations are going to be of financial institutions, but the details as to how exactly that will translate into practice for the different types of financial institutions will be dealt with through the conduct standards, potentially even through joint standards if there are dual regulators like the PA and the FSCA. And then also lastly, to remember that the outcomes are the key thing to always bear in mind when working through COFI and reading through COFI, the key thing is to make sure that we achieve those fair outcomes and that we deliver, as a financial institution, deliver the outcomes that are expected or that have been communicated or disclosed to the financial customer. And then with the risk-based and proportionality requirements, this is there very specifically to enable the FSCA to see how best suited that type of financial institution and what's required from them in terms of COFI, because it can't be a one-size-fits-all. You've got varying types of different financial institutions who do different things, who have different market segments. And as much as COFI is a framework, the detail is going to be coming through in these bespoke conduct standards, depending on what type of financial institution you actually are. Moving on. So with the, there was a complete rehaul of the bill, the second draft of the bill compared to the first draft of the bill. So essentially the first chapter is still the same, dealing with interpretation, objectives, and application. And what's key to note here is that the definitions, it's very important when you're reading COFI that you have the FSR Act next to you, because the definitions, if they're not defined in COFI, then they're defined in the FSR Act. So you need to read these in conjunction with one another, because the FSR Act is the umbrella piece of legislation that is now actually setting out the architecture. Also, what was quite interesting to see in the response document with the second draft of the bill, Treasury was actually posing to the commentators and to the industry on whether they think COFI should be a separate standalone piece of legislation, or should it actually be included under the FSR Act as a separate chapter under the FSR Act, and then similarly all the other remaining financial sector laws like the Insurance Act, should that actually then be included or infused under the FSR Act as different chapters, so that there's one massive piece of legislation for the financial services sector, starting off with the FSR and then having different chapters underneath it dealing with the different nuances depending on what type of financial institution you are. And I think the initial feeling from industry around this is, yes, that sounds great, but that's going to take a lot of work in order to get everything to one massive piece of legislation, and that's going to delay the actual implementation of COFI. This is what we know and what we've been working on. So long term, yes, that sounds fantastic, but for the time being, I think we still need to keep COFI as a separate piece of legislation, deal with it, get that settled, and thereafter they can decide how to transition or to incorporate it into one big piece of legislation. Then moving on to licensing. So initially in the first version of the bill, the licensing chapter under COFI was very lengthy and very detailed. And in the second version of the bill, this has been refined quite a bit. The reason being is that the FSR Act already had sections and provisions dealing with licensing of financial institutions. So there was not really, it was a duplication, having licensing requirements under COFI and licensing requirements under the FSR Act. And the best or the better suited place for the licensing requirements or provisions is actually the FSR Act, because it's the PA and the FSCA and the other types of regulators who are empowered to grant licenses. So I think this is a welcome change in that all the detail and criteria relating to licensing has been removed out of COFI. There's still, I think, about 2 or 3 pages dealing with licensing in COFI, but the detail is actually now being amended or enhanced under the FSR Act, because that's the act that gives the FSCA the powers or the authority to grant licensing. Then moving on to Chapter 3, which is not applicable to retirement funds, but this is dealing with the appointment of representatives. So we all know representatives currently fall under the phase piece of legislation, and phase is one of the financial sector laws that are going to be repealed in its entirety. So they need to include now a section or a chapter under COFI dealing with exactly how representatives are appointed, how they are debarred, and so forth. Then Chapter 4, which is the most important chapter under COFI, is the culture and governance one. And this was also rewritten quite a bit. You'll recall in the first version of COFI, each of the chapters, at the end of the chapters, then went and listed the whole list of types of conduct standards the FSCA could issue in respect of that particular chapter. I think the one under financial services and products, it listed A to Z, the different types of conduct standards the FSCA could issue for in relation to that. And what they've actually done now is they've realized that that was just too cumbersome and too rules-based, And the whole purpose of COFI is to be a framework setting up principles. So all those detailed listing of what type of conduct standards would be issued under COFI have been taken out of the bill this time. And what they've gone and done is enhanced the sections in the FSR Act that deal with the issuing of conduct standards, of joint standards, and then expanded on what type of conduct standards the FECA will be permitted to issue. And again, I think this makes more sense because that is the enabling provision is contained in the FSR Act. It shouldn't be contained in the COFI bill. So what will happen is the FECA will be issuing conduct standards to deal with the COFI requirements, but the empowering provisions are going to be contained under the FSR piece of legislation. So I was digressing there. Culture and governance. This is such an important chapter to understand, because as we know with financial institutions who've had to implement TCF, the key cornerstone of TCF is the culture and governance. You have to have the right culture within the organization in order to deliver on the TCF outcomes. And once that's right, the rest will actually follow quite naturally and easily. And governance is also a very important thing that needs to be focused on to make sure that within the financial institution, you've got the right checks and balances in place that give effect to the culture and give effect to the outcomes, the fair outcomes for the financial customers. So also in this chapter 4 on governance, they deal with the issues around conflict of interest. They've also got a whole section on dealing with remuneration principles. So this is a very important chapter. And also they've moved away from making reference to, in the previous bill, they said there needs to be a governance policy. There needs to be a conflict of interest policy. And they've recognized that not all financial institutions operate in the same manner. So now they're using wording or language around governance arrangements and compliance arrangements. So they're not going to be prescriptive in terms of how you demonstrate the delivery or how you deliver or how you demonstrate the principles of achieving what's required under these chapters. Rather, each financial institution will need to go and apply their minds and think what needs to be put in place in order to demonstrate that we are living these principles and achieving these outcomes for the financial customers. Then the next chapter, which is also quite an important one, is financial products and financial services. The reason why this is also important for retirement funds is that a retirement fund is seen to be providing a financial product, and that's the license that retirement funds would need to apply for under COFI, because the product that they're providing is a benefit from the retirement fund. And also under this chapter, there's one of the criticisms of the first version of the bill is it wasn't clear how COFI applies to a financial customer versus a retail financial customer, because there's a separate, so financial customers defined under FSR, retail financial customers defined under COFI, which is a subset of financial customer. And it wasn't clear how exactly COFI was meant to be applying to in general to financial customers, and then what was the enhanced or additional protection afforded to your retail financial customer. And what they've done now is they've refined it quite a lot, and there's a very specific sections, I think it's clause 27 now, specifically dealing with the enhanced requirements or duties when you're dealing with a retail financial customer. This chapter 5 also deals with what we understand in the TCF world around the design of a product or the design of a financial services, and what needs to be taken into account when you are designing a product, and you need to take into account what is the targeted financial customer. Now, target financial customer doesn't mean each individual. If you're operating in the SMME space, then that's your targeted financial customer segment versus a institutional client or the low income market. That's what they're talking about here. They're not expecting financial institutions to look at each individual person's circumstances. It's a targeted financial customer segment that needs to be taken, who's this product being targeted at, and is it going to be meeting their needs? How is it going to be distributed, and so forth. Then there's also a chapter dealing with advertising and disclosure, setting out very similar principles that we've seen in the policyholder protection rules for insurers. There's also a chapter dealing with post-sale barriers and obligations. This is setting out what's required from a claims perspective as well as complaints when customers want to change financial products, what needs to happen in those instances. Then chapter 8, which is the safeguarding of assets and operational requirements. They've had to introduce this one because one of the financial sector laws that are being repealed is the Financial Institution Protection of Funds Act. And all the provisions that are contained in that piece of legislation are now being dealt with under Chapter 8 of COFI. And then they've also included operational requirements in terms of ensuring that financial institutions understand what they need to have from an operational capability perspective in order to give effect to the requirements under COFI. Chapter 9 deals with reporting, and this is also quite an important section. It deals with the annual financial statements of financial institutions. It deals with the appointment of auditors. Certain public disclosures need to happen from a reporting point of view. But there are certain carve-outs because for certain types of financial institutions, because some like banks and insurers currently have reporting and auditor and so forth duties under the Banks Act and the Insurance Act. So Chapter 9 also in certain instances applies to all financial institutions, but in some instances it doesn't. Certain parts or provisions don't apply to what's called prudentially regulated financial institutions. There's also sections under the operational requirements that make reference to POPI to make sure that financial institutions are giving effect to what's required under POPI. And there's also very specific mention to FICA, where if you are an accountable financial institution under the FICA legislation, that you do have the necessary operational ability or capability to give effect to what's required from you under the FICA legislation. Then moving on to Chapter 10, which is the credit rating services. That's not applicable for the retirement fund sector. But the reason why there's a Chapter 10 dealing with this is because the Credit Rating Services Act has been repealed also in its entirety and now needs to be catered for under the COFI bill. Chapter 11 is general provisions. This is also quite an important section to take note of because it's under this chapter that deals with the setting of the conduct standards. It sets out the process that needs to be followed for applications and notifications. So what you'll see is in certain requirements in COFI, and we'll probably find more detail in the conduct standards, in certain instances, the FECA needs to be notified of certain activities. In certain instances, the FECA needs to grant approval for certain types of activities that the financial institution is performing. And this Chapter 11 is setting out exactly what needs to happen with the notifications and approval. And then lastly, it's Chapter 12, which is the final provisions. Again, very important content contained in here because it's setting out that notwithstanding that certain primary pieces of law like the phase legislation and so forth are being repealed, even though those laws are being repealed, all the regulation, all the regulatory instruments, everything that was issued under that primary law still remains in force and in effect until such time that it's either converted to a conduct standard or until such time that the FECA or another responsible authority makes amendments to it. So yes, this looks quite daunting. And what I just want to remind everyone is, as much as this looks very daunting and very big, it's very much a framework. And the National Treasury and the FECA have said in their response document that we must remember that different conduct standards will be issued for the different types of retirement funds, because one of the key considerations in the first version of the bill was you couldn't imagine exactly how COFI would apply to your normal closed standalone occupational funds. How would it apply to your retail funds that do have, who do market and do solicit members to join those funds? So they have taken that to heart and recognized that it's not a one-size-fits-all when it comes to retirement funds. And that's why when Amina speaks later on the consequential amendments to the Pension Funds Act, they are hoping or they're proposing to address it by inserting different definitions of the different types of retirement funds under the Pension Funds Act, will now enable them under COFI to set different types of conduct standards for the different types of retirement funds. And this is where we'll get a better understanding or a clear indication of exactly how Chapter 5 would apply to the different types of retirement funds and so forth. Okay. Then moving on to the key changes from the first version to the second version of the bill. As I mentioned, the enabling provisions around the different types of conduct standards that were contained in COFI have been taken out completely. And what they've done is refined the FSR Act sections, I think it's section 106 and 108, where it's setting out or listing the different types of conduct standards the FECA can issue in respect of COFI. And again, we mustn't lose sight that they do have the ability or the authority to apply proportionality to the different types of conduct standards, depending on the financial institution that they would be dealing with. Again, with the licensing chapter, that's also been refined because the FSR Act has been expanded on in terms of what criteria and requirements are required in order to apply for a COFI license under the COFI bill. Then regarding transformation, as I mentioned, this is a very key and a key matter for our regulators as well for ourselves. We know we've currently got the voluntary scorecard under the financial sector charter for the top 100 funds. I think the IRFA had a session or a webinar earlier on this year with the Transformation Council, where they said that they are re-looking at this. They are considering whether to make it or to remove this voluntary dispensation from that and make it mandatory for all types of retirement funds. So what the COFI bill is saying is that a financial institution needs to have a transformation plan. And this transformation plan is the same plan that is understood in the context of the BBBEE piece of legislation. So it's not something new. It's exactly the same thing. But what's happening now is a financial institution needs to have a transformation plan with tangible targets, and that now enhance the FSCA's powers or objectives to say that the FSCA needs to actually go and check how are financial institutions delivering on these transformation plans. And by virtue of granting or empowering the FSCA this jurisdiction over how financial institutions are actually delivering on the transformation plans, is if they find that a financial institution is not meeting its targets or is not delivering on the plan and outcome stated in that transformation plan, they then have the tools under the FSR Act in terms of enforcement. So we could very likely see that where a financial institution is failing to meet the targets in the transformation plan, that the FSCA can issue directives to those financial institutions, compelling them to actually give effect to their transformation plans. Another key change from the first bill to the second bill is they've now removed reference in Schedule 1 to medical schemes and medical schemes administrators. So in the first version of the bill, under the list or under the schedule dealing with which activities require a COFI license, medical schemes were included because under the FSR Act definition of financial product, it includes a benefit provided for by a medical scheme. Similarly, under financial services, financial services, where medical scheme administrator was rendering those services, it also falls under the definition of financial services. So the FSR Act does include within its jurisdiction medical schemes and medical schemes administrators. So consequently, in the first version of the bill, these activities were then listed as an activity that required licensing. However, they did mention in their response document that a separate task team has been set up very specifically to deal with medical schemes and medical schemes administrators, together with the NHI, the National Health Insurance Bill, that's currently underway and going through the consultation process, is that they need to go and, as this task team between the Council for Medical Schemes, the PA, the FSCA, and Treasury, they need to decide how best do medical schemes and the administrators need to be regulated and supervised, knowing that we're moving towards this NHI world. So, and also, as I mentioned earlier, you know, the FSR Act does, or the PA is the regulator for medical schemes. However, that power has been delegated to the Council for Medical Schemes up until March 2024. So I think there's still a lot of balls up in the air exactly how they want to supervise and regulate medical schemes and their administrators. But just to note also on this point that brokers who give advice on medical schemes and benefits from medical schemes, they still need to be licensed under COFI. So the only thing that's been proposed to be removed under COFI is the actual medical scheme itself requiring a license and the administrator of the medical scheme. Another key change is around the Collective Investment Scheme Controls Act. So the first version of the bill proposed to repeal this piece of legislation in its entirety. There was an extensive submission done by CISA where they did a gap analysis between what the CISCA Act required, what COFI required, and there were a whole host of gaps that were identified. So what's being proposed now is CISCA will be dealt with in a similar manner as to how the Pension Funds Act is being dealt with. Certain sections in CISCA will be repealed because they'll be addressed or dealt with under COFI, but the provisions that are remaining under CISCA will still be dealing with the prudential requirements and the financial soundness requirements when coming to CISs. They've also introduced a new licensing activity called corporate advisory services. So that's not, this isn't very relevant for the retirement fund industry, but it was obviously as a result of consultation that happened with your big corporate investment banking, because certain of their activities do fall under the definition of financial services within the FSR Act. So by virtue of that, that pulled them into the net of COFI. So what they're proposing is with these corporate advisory services, as much as the financial institution needs to apply for a COFI license, there'll be limited scope in terms of how COFI applies to that activity, because these services are usually offered or rendered to your professional type of customer or your institutional type of customer. So what they're proposing is for if a financial institution is licensed to render corporate advisory services, in terms of COFI, it will only be Chapter 4, which deals with culture and governance, that applies to that financial institution, and not all the other chapters that deal with your advertising and disclosure and so forth. And then also, as Leanne mentioned at the introduction, there are half of the bill is just dealing with consequential amendments. The most important one for us is obviously the Pension Funds Act, which Amin is going to take you through. The changes to the Financial Markets Act, to CISCA, as well as the FSR Act and the Insurance Act. And then also in the second version of the bill, which wasn't in the first, was the offences. And so there was wording, but the monetary amounts were missing from the first version of the bill. So now in the second version of the bill, we can see exactly what they are proposing. The monetary values and the offences that they are proposing align quite, do align to what's contained in the FSR Act. So very important to note that if a person is required to be licensed under COFI and they're not, they can receive a penalty or up to 15 million rand or imprisonment or both. So this is very important to note. Then also, if someone contravenes these sections dealing with being appointed as a rep, the penalties are up to 10 million or imprisonment of 10 years or both. Then dealing with Chapter 8, which deals with the property that needs to be held in trust or assets of a financial institution. So this is similar provisions that were contained under the Financial Institution Protection of Funds Act. That's been carried across to say that if a person contravenes where they are required to hold customers or financial customers' money in trust, that if they fail to do so, the penalties can be up to 100,000 or imprisonment of 20 years or both. Also, again, with the investment of trust property, this is where if you're commingling trust property with the money or assets of the financial institution, quite hefty penalties here of up to 50 million or 10 years. And then again, also, so you can see the bulk of the penalties are dealing with the safeguarding of financial customers' assets and making sure that they are protected. Also key to note that they are proposing further enhancements to the chapters under the FSR Act that deal with enforcement. One of the proposals that they are making is that they want to allow the regulators to issue a takedown notice. So a takedown notice is where if the FSCA or PLA come across something on the internet where someone is advertising or soliciting or marketing business on the internet that's in contravention of the financial sector law, and financial sector law includes COFI, that they can then instruct the internet service provider to take down that marketing or advertising that's on the internet. And also what they've done is under the administrative penalty section of the FSR Act, they're also now expanding that where the regulators issue an administrative penalty, they can also, as part of the quantum or value of that administrative penalty, include a monetary amount that's required to be given to a prejudiced financial customer to redress any prejudice that the financial customer might have incurred by the financial institution when dealing with them. So just to recap, so currently there are 13 financial sector laws. Once COFI, or what COFI is proposing, is that the following financial sector laws will be repealed in their entirety. So what's remaining in the Long-Term Insurance Act is going to be repealed. The Short-Term Insurance Act, the Financial Institution Protection of Funds Act, the phase legislation, and the Credit Rating Services Act and the Friendly Societies Act. So those primary pieces of law will be repealed. However, there are certain financial sector laws that are remaining, and that's through all the consequential amendments that we're going to be speaking about later. But notwithstanding that these primary pieces of legislation are being repealed, the COFI bill is very explicit that anything that was done under a section of an act that was repealed or amended still remains in force and effect. Similarly, if anything was prescribed under an act that was repealed or amendment, that still remains in force and in effect. Any authorization, approval, registration, consent, or similar permission that was granted under that financial sector law will still remain in place. Any regulatory instrument that was issued will still remain in force and effect. Similarly, any notice, rules, or any other form of subordinate legislation, including regulation, will still stay in effect. So, for example, as much as the Long-Term Insurance Act is going to be repealed, the policyholder protection rules, which were issued, I think, under Section 66 of that Act, will still remain in force, will still remain in effect. Similarly, with the phase legislation, or with the phase act, the code of conduct will still remain. All the board notices dealing with fit and proper will remain. And what needs to happen is, over time, though, all these subordinate pieces of legislation need to transition or convert either into a conduct standard. In some instances, it might even be a joint standard between the PA and the FSCA. Okay. So just to also highlight what changes are being proposed under COFI to the remaining financial sector law, I'm not going to touch the Pension Funds Act because that's what Amin is speaking to. But in terms of the FSR Act, they are making amendments to the FSR Act to ensure that there's alignment with definitions contained between COFI and the FSR Act. They're making changes, as I mentioned, to support the transformation. That's going to be an explicit function of the FSCA under FSR. They're strengthening the licensing provisions as well as the conduct standing provisions. The enforcement provisions I've spoken about that they are expanding on. And they're also inserting a chapter dealing with equivalence frameworks. The equivalence framework we find in the CISCA legislation and also in the insurance legislation, where you're offering a foreign we're offering a product that's subject to foreign jurisdiction. It's now enabling the applicable regulatory authority in South Africa to recognize equivalence of frameworks of foreign jurisdictions. And then also very importantly is they're inserting a whole chapter on recovery and exit. So currently we've got the Protection of Financial Institutions Act that deals with what happens if a financial institution's in distress, if a curator needs to be appointed, if a statutory manager needs to be appointed, and also what needs to happen if they want to exit the market. So because that piece of legislation has been repealed, it now needs to be catered for under the FSR Act. If they've got a chapter, there's currently an amendment to the FSR Act sitting in front of Parliament dealing with exit and recovery for systemically important financial institutions. That's it's a defined term under the FSR Act, where the PA or SARB can designate certain types of financial institutions to be designated as a systemically important financial institution. Usually you find this with all your big banks and insurers. So that regulation is currently in front of Parliament, waiting for that to go through the parliamentary process. But they're introducing a Chapter 12B to deal with non-systemically important financial institutions and what needs to happen in those instances where they either need to exit or if they need to be, if they are in financial distress. Then moving on to the Financial Markets Act, Treasury's, I think, released 2 papers on the review that they're currently doing within the financial markets landscape. They do recognize that there potentially could be overlap between COFI and the FMA, but what they're wanting to do for the time being is just FMA will remain and until such time that they've gone through the consultation process regarding the review that they're doing in the Financial Markets Act. But until that's settled, the FMA and COFI will still remain. They're just doing consequential amendments to make alignment across the different types of definitions, and then also to cater for the recovery and exit. The Collective Investment Controls Act, I've also mentioned there, it's no longer being repealed. Certain amendments are being made for where matters are being dealt with under COFI. Those are being repealed under CISCA, and then what's left behind is what still will remain within the CISCA Act regarding how CISs are dealt with. I've spoken about the Medical Schemes Acts, and then, the second column here shouldn't be financial markets, it should be the Insurance Act. But I mean, there's minor amendments to the Insurance Act, also just dealing with the exit and recovery provisions. And then the Cooperatives Act, because the Friendly Societies Act has been repealed, and they will now need to be registered under the Cooperatives Act, there's certain amendments being made there. So also just to remind everyone that the PA has extended its delegation powers regarding prudential supervision or regulation to the FECA for CISs and friendly societies and retirement funds up until March 2024. And similarly, they've also extended the delegation to the Council for Medical Schemes in relation to medical schemes up until March 2024. Then just moving on to the schedules and COFI. So it's also very important when you're reading COFI to understand exactly who does COFI apply to. So that you'll find under Schedule 1. So Schedule 1 lists all the activities and the sub-activities that require a COFI license. So if you are an institution and you're performing anything that meets one of those definitions under Schedule 1, that means you will be required to be licensed under COFI. And I've just listed there very high level, or just the main activities. There's a whole host of sub-activities for each main activity as well under Schedule 1. But the important one for retirement funds is the first one, which is the providing of a financial product. Schedule 2 was incomplete in the first version of the bill, and it's now being completed in the second version. And what they are addressing here is that in certain circumstances, an institution needs to have a very specific type of form before it can actually apply for the COFI license. So for example, an insurer can't apply for a COFI license to provide a financial product, which is an insurance product, unless they've actually been granted a license by the Prudential Authority to be an insurer. Similarly with retirement funds. A retirement fund will first need to be registered or have its rules registered and be created as a separate legal person under the Pension Funds Act. And only thereafter, once that separate juristic person has been created or established, then they can apply for the COFI license under or apply for the activity or the license under COFI. Schedule 3 deals with the activities of representatives. So this was also blank in the first version, and it's been slightly expanded on in the second version. It's still not very clear to me exactly where this is going to land, because as we know, there's still certain policy positions that need to be taken around the various RDR initiatives, specifically around advisor categorization. There's also a whole host of uncertainty that was or debate that's happening with the RDR investment paper. So this, as much as it lists different activities, I think there's still going to be changes to Schedule 3 once the RDR policy considerations have been firmed up. Schedule 4 is also very important. This deals with the transitional arrangements. So what COFI is proposing is that once it's enacted or promulgated, all existing financial institutions must be licensed under COFI within 3 years after the effective date of COFI. So what this means is that notwithstanding that the phase legislation has been repealed, those FSPs are still going to be considered to be a licensed financial institution, but they will have 3 years in which they need to transition and apply for the COFI license under the COFI legislation. So what Schedule 4 is setting out is all the different transitional arrangements that will apply in those instances, that they still remain licensed, that they'll need to apply for a license. And also what COFI is saying is that the FECA actually needs to publish a licensing framework. So I think it's also very uncertain to financial institutions on how exactly are we now meant to apply for a COFI license? What's going to be expected from us? What are the timelines that we need to work towards? So what is required from the FECA, I think it's within 2 months or 3 months of COFI becoming enacted, they must actually publish a licensing framework which will set out the detail that needs to be, or the detail around applying for a COFI license or transitioning into a COFI license. I think it will probably be very similar to what insurers experienced, where they had to convert their license from the old Insurance Act to the new Insurance Act. So it'll probably be a similar process. However, with COFI, it's the number of financial institutions impacted is a lot bigger. I mean, it's every single FSP that's currently licensed under phase. It's all the retirement funds, it's all the insurers. So this is quite a mammoth task that is going to be have to be dealt with by the FECA once COFI lands. And then Schedule 5, very important, is all the consequential amendments that are being proposed, the most important one being the Pension Funds Act. Okay, so now after all of that, I just wanted to hone in on, with the second version of the COFI bill, what does it mean? What does this mean for retirement funds? So just to recap, a retirement fund or a pension fund organization, which is going to be amended to a retirement fund, is a financial institution in terms of the FSR. So that's very clear. And the reason why it's a financial institution is because they are providing a financial product. And that financial product is the providing of benefits to its members by virtue of that member, by virtue of the member being a member of the retirement fund. So because the retirement fund is a financial institution and it is providing a financial product, it will have to be licensed under COFI. So all retirement funds will be required to be licensed under COFI. And the extract that I've got at the bottom there is out of Schedule 1. So you'll see there, I think it's 1B, is providing retirement benefits. And what this is saying is that if you are a financial institution, or if you are an institution that provides retirement benefits, you will be required to be licensed under COFI. So all retirement funds, including public sector funds, all retirement funds will have to obtain a COFI license once it is enacted, and hopefully we will see the detail around what's required in the FSCA's licensing framework. Very important to also remember in the context of retirement funds is that under the FSR Act, the governing body includes the board of a retirement fund. So all trustees, you are considered to be a governing body. Also important to note that under the definition of key person in the FSR Act, a key person also includes a member of a governing body. So trustees have got two considerations that they need to give effect or consider. One, collectively, the Board of Trustees is a governing body, but also the individual members are considered key persons under the FSR Act, which I'm going to speak to later. And you need to understand, what does that mean to be a key person under the FSR Act? So the important thing to note here is that is that a financial institution must have arrangements in place to make sure that they are complying with the requirements under COFI, and that they also need to make sure that any instances of non-compliance that's identified, but it's material non-compliance, needs to be reported through to the FSCA. So what COFI is requiring is that the financial institutions must have arrangements in place to give effect to what's required under COFI. And then if the FSCA, through their on-sites or investigations, actually see that a financial institution is not giving effect to what's required in terms of COFI, or is not complying with the requirements of COFI, they've actually got the ability to go and appoint an independent person to come in and assess exactly how is a financial institution giving effect to the requirements under COFI. And that appointment of an independent person will be for the cost of the financial institution. The FSCA can also direct if they're doing an investigation and find out that things are not in place to give effect to what's required under COFI, they can actually issue a directive. So you as a body, you must do X, Y, and Z to make sure that you are giving effect or complying with the requirements under COFI. Also important to note is around the governing body requiring to give effect to the governance and culture within the organization. So what this is saying is that the governing body, which is the Board of Trustees, needs to promote the fair treatment of their financial customers. They also need to ensure that they are enhancing and supporting the efficiency and integrity of the financial markets. They need to make sure that they provide support to enable trust and confidence in the financial services sector, and they need to promote transformation in a manner that's consistent with their transformation plan. These are almost the overarching principles that always need to be borne in mind when giving effect to COFI, is that we need to make sure whatever we as a board or retirement fund or financial institution are doing is, are we promoting the fair treatment of customers? Are we doing or making the right decisions that support the efficiency and integrity of the financial market? And are our actions and what we're doing actually creating trust and confidence within the financial services sector? So yes, this does sound very daunting, but it must be, thought through or applied to the context of a particular situation. Like I mentioned earlier, not everyone will be applying things in the same manner, we need to think through this and what it's asking of the different types of financial institutions and of the different types of governing bodies, because the context is very important when giving effect and understanding what COFI means for that particular financial institution. Then just moving on to some, so just to go back here, the one thing that's still got a question mark in my mind, and I think also with other colleagues that I've spoken to in the industry, it's still not clear, even with this framework and even with the acknowledgement that in certain, different conduct standards will be issued for different types of retirement funds. It's still not clear, specifically with retirement funds, is where does the ultimate accountability reside? Because we've got different types of financial institutions involved within the value chain of retirement funds. And, in my mind, it's always the governing body or the board of trustees or the board of management that, the buck always stops with them when it comes to retirement funds. But it's not very clear within the way that COFI has been written is that still the intention, or will things potentially change depending on the type of retirement fund that you're dealing with? So that's one of the submissions we will be making through to National Treasury very specifically on this is the intention that things will still remain as we currently understand, where the board still has the ultimate accountability and responsibility to the members of the retirement fund, or is the intention that potentially could change over time depending on the different types of retirement funds that are out there. Then also key changes from the first version to the second version of the bill, they introduced the definition of sponsor. And it wasn't clear exactly who was all pulled into the net or caught in the net under this definition. And they've clarified that a sponsor is not an employer, it's not a union, it's not any other entities that establish a retirement fund. A sponsor, they've enhanced now to say there's a commercial sponsor of a retirement fund. And the reason why they've introduced this is that they recognize that in certain instances, you might have a financial institution who wants to set up a brand new RA fund or a brand new umbrella fund. And leading up to actually establishing that fund, there's a whole product design and a whole host of activities that take place before they actually go and register a set of rules. So this is why they've introduced the definition of a sponsor, is where there is a financial institution that wants to establish or set up a new commercially sponsored fund. Certain requirements are expected from them while they're designing exactly how this commercial sponsored fund will look. And then once the fund is registered, then that sponsor responsibility or sponsor requirements fall away, because that sponsor is already an existing financial institution. It might be an insurer, it might be an administrator, it might be someone else, but that sponsor is already a financial institution. So there's no requirement for a sponsor to obtain a COFI license, because only a financial institution can actually establish a commercially sponsored retirement fund. One of the other big changes and very welcome changes is in the first version of the bill, there was a requirement under the activities that required licensing that a trustee would need to be licensed under COFI. So that's been removed. You'll see under Schedule 1, there's no longer, I think it was called professional trustee services, that activity has been removed. So trustees do not need to obtain a COFI license in their own capacity. But what is important to note for trustees is that they, because they are a governing body, there are fit and proper requirements that will apply to them, because there's a definition of fit and proper under COFI. Fit and proper, again, is a very big, broad definition, but it will be dealt with through bespoke conduct standards depending on which type of governing body you're dealing with. So that's a key thing to note for trustees. You won't need to be licensed, but the COFI bill does have enabling provisions to issue conduct standards very specifically on fit and proper requirements. The principal executive officer and the deputy, they are now going to also fall within the definition of key person, and I'm going to get to some detail just now on exactly what that means. Also a big change, an employer. An employer is also going, or is going to be pulled into the definition of supervised entities. So supervised entities being amended in FSR to extend to include an employer. But important to note that this is very limited only to when the employer's obligations or responsibilities under Section 13A of the Pension Funds Act. But I've got a slide just now dealing with that. Then also asset consultants. I wasn't aware of this, but apparently there were some asset consultants in the industry who were of the view that the advice that they give to funds, retirement funds, didn't constitute advice under phase. So what they've cleared up now is that an asset consultant will be required, or they've expanded the definition of financial advice under COFI to make it clear that asset consultants do fall under that activity and therefore will be required to be licensed. Key thing for administrators. So we all know currently an administrator is given what we call a Section 13B license under the Pension Funds Act. Section 13B, as Amina will speak to, is being repealed. And the reason for that is all administrators, whether you are a third-party administrator or whether you are a self-administered fund, those administrators will need to obtain a COFI license under Schedule 1 of COFI. And then also just to reiterate, as was in the first version of the bill, and it's been carried over into the second version of the bill, is that public sector funds fall within the definition of retirement funds. They will need to be licensed under COFI. There's also amendments under the Pension Funds Act, which Amina will speak to, but they do make provision that the FECA can grant certain exemptions or conditions to public sector funds. However, as much as all these changes are very welcomed, it's still not clear, and I suppose it will take some time through industry discussions or workshops to understand where, which sections under the Pension Funds Act will be best placed under COFI, because the amendments that they're making, or the consequential amendments, are not repealing any sections like we've seen in CISCA. The only one that's been repealed is Section 13B. So we still need to see over time exactly what will be left in the Pension Funds Act, and will certain things then be transitions under COFI to a conduct standard, or possibly even a joint standard. So just very quickly, I see I don't have much time left. So supervised entity, I've just got an extract of the amendment that's being proposed to the FSR Act. So what this means is an employer who participates in an occupational fund, they're going to be seen as a supervised entity, but limited to Section 13A. And by being pulled into the net of a supervised entity, this then means that the FECA can issue regulatory instruments very specifically to that type of financial institution. To that supervised entity. So the regulatory instruments that the FECA will probably be issuing to a supervised entity, which is an employer, will be conduct standards in relation to how they deal with Section 13A. We know 13A has been a challenge in the industry for many, many, many years. And so what they're doing now is actually granting the FECA's jurisdiction over an employer, where they can issue conduct standards to the employer in terms of Section 13A. But also important to remember, by being pulled into the net of a supervised entity, there's certain chapters under the FSR Act now that also apply to a supervised entity. So one of those chapters is Chapter 9, and Chapter 9 deals with the information gathering, the on-sites, and the investigations. So this means the FECA will be able to do an on-site visit on an employer, but limited to information gathering around Section 13A of the Pension Funds Act, and to see whether there's certain information they need from the employer, whether they need to do an investigation because of non-compliance with 13A. They will now have that authority under Chapter 9 of the FSR Act. Similarly, they will also have enforcement mechanisms or tools that they can institute against the supervised entity who's the employer. So they'll be able to issue directives against the employer. They can enter into enforceable undertakings and so forth. So all the enforcement provisions will now also be applicable to the relationship between the FECA and the employer, but limited to the 13A responsibilities. And then also, because the employer will be considered a supervised entity, they can issue administrative penalties against the employer if they are failing to comply with the financial sector law, which includes COFI, and which will also extend to any conduct standard if they do issue conduct standards against that employer. Then also, now that the PEO is going to be a key person, and also to remember what I'm speaking about here for key person for a PEO applies very similarly to a trustee or board member, because they are also, by virtue of being a part of the governing body of the retirement fund, they're also considered a key person. So the PEO is now going to be a key or part of the definition of key person under the FSR Act. Then there's under Chapter 4, Part 5, there's a very specific section in COFI dealing with key persons. So they say a key person needs to be fit and proper. They'll issue conduct standards in terms of what constitutes being fit and proper. They also say that if there's non-compliance with the COFI Act, that they can direct their key person to make arrangements to address the non-compliance. They can also say that if a key person, if they find a key person to be wanting in terms of not meeting the fitness and propriety requirements or not delivering on what's expected of a key person, they can direct that governing body or financial institution to say that the key person needs additional training. Potentially that key person needs extra resources to help support them. So there's a whole, if you're a principal officer, please go read chapter 4, part 5 to understand exactly what COFI is saying around the expectations of key persons. But also, please bear in mind, as much as, COFI is a framework and COFI does allow for exemption provisions. So as much as chapter 4, part 5 is dealing with key persons and their expectations, there is still the ability to grant exemptions in certain circumstances. So the FECA can grant certain exemptions to promote proportionality of the application of COFI. If practicalities impede the application, they can also grant exemptions. If an exemption is required to help implement financial inclusion or development or transformation objectives. And also they can grant not industry specific, but they can grant an exemption to a very specific category or subcategory of a financial institution or key persons. So you might find in certain instances that there's a generic exemption granted to a very specific industry and type of financial institution. However, having said that, as much as you're a key person and potentially there could be exemptions, potentially not, the FSR Act enforcement provisions are very important to understand in terms of what can happen to a key person or by virtue of being a key person. So again, directives, the FECA can issue a directive directly to the key person or the PEO, compelling them to take certain action. If a key person is found to be contravening a financial sector law, they can remove that person from that position. However, it's not just an automatic removal. They have to consult and they have to allow for submissions and so forth. But there are very drastic measures or drastic enforcement mechanisms available within the FSR Act that need to be understood in the context of being a key person. Similarly, they can also potentially debar a key person if they find them to consistently or materially be failing to comply with financial sector law. However, they can't just, with a debarment, again, there is a consultation process. Mitigating submissions can be made, but it's just very important to understand that, as much as there are procedural and consultation processes within all the enforcement mechanisms, the FECA has got a very big and deep toolkit available to them that they can utilize if they do find key persons or governing bodies failing to deliver on what's required from them. And then also, just to end off here, is that notwithstanding and hopefully not scaring everybody, there's still the avenue of, if the FECA does take a remedial action or enforcement action, we've got the Financial Services Tribunal, where all these types of enforcement mechanisms can be referred to if someone is unhappy with what's happening from the FECA. So I'm going to hand over now to Amina.
Hi, Chantal. Hi, everyone. Thank you. Chantal, can I now share my screen?
Yes, please.
Okay. Good morning to everyone. As Chantal has said, I will be discussing the consequential amendments to the Pension Funds Act. What is the first glaring change in COFI is the fact that they've now changed the name of the Pension Funds Act to the Retirement Funds Act. And according to Treasury, the rationale for doing this is that a pension fund is only one type of regulated retirement fund, and it's therefore confusing to use the term pension fund to refer to all the other types of regulated retirement funds. Accordingly, they've now added different definitions for the different types of retirement funds including pension fund, pension preservation fund, retirement annuity fund, and so forth. So all these regulated funds will now be called retirement funds instead of pension funds and pension fund organizations. And the proposed definition by COFI for retirement fund is an arrangement established with the primary object of providing annuities or lump sum payments on retirement of a member or for payments of benefits to beneficiaries upon the death of a member. But as explained, the definitions that they've now added, they have now changed from referring to the Income Tax Act and have provided a description of what these funds actually do. So, for example, with a provident fund, they have said that it means a retirement fund where a member may receive the member's full benefit upon retirement. The purpose of the change is to enable the bill, which will soon become an act, to set different conduct standards for the different types of funds. Chantal touched on that earlier on, so that there's no confusion as to which conduct standard applies to a particular fund, and also to clarify the application of some of the provisions in COFI to these funds. In addition to amending the definitions of what a pension fund, a retirement annuity fund, and so forth, what it is that they do, COFI has now included new definitions for occupational funds and commercially sponsored funds. It has then also amended the definition for umbrella funds and beneficiary funds. Occupational funds are funds established by principal employers or a group of companies for the benefit of their employees. Currently, in the industry, we would call these standalone funds. Umbrella funds, on the other hand, likewise with the other pension fund, with the other definitions of pension fund and retirement annuity fund, refers to what it actually does, but makes specific reference to it applying to various participating employers. And the wording seems to refer to type A umbrella funds as it is. Doesn't expressly include type B funds, but it doesn't exclude them either. What is interesting to see is that COFI has now included a definition of sub-fund, which refers to the part of an umbrella fund that relates to a particular participating employer. Before this, the definition of sub-fund you'd usually get in various rules of umbrella funds. And so now that they've included this, they've done so intentionally, but I will explain that in the coming slides. A commercially sponsored fund is a retirement fund that's established by a commercial sponsor. Now, COFI has defined a commercial sponsor as a licensed financial institution that establishes a retirement fund with the intent that it, as a financial institution, will provide financial products and financial services to the retirement fund once it has been established, as well or its members. So either to the fund or its members. Beneficiary fund, that has been expanded, and they've given a longer definition to what a beneficiary fund is. I just want to read it. It says that beneficiary funds refer to an arrangement established with the object of receiving, administering, investing, and paying benefits that become payable to a dependent or nominee in terms of Section 37C, or in respect of the employment of a member on behalf of beneficiaries, or that became otherwise payable to natural persons on the death of an insured person in terms of one or more policies of insurance, and payable on the death of more than one member of one or more retirement funds on the death of any of their members. The issue that we may run into regarding this definition of beneficiary funds is it's not clear whether the amendment includes a scenario where the proceeds of an individual risk policy, as opposed to an employer unapproved risk policy, which are due to a minor beneficiary, may also be paid into such beneficiary fund. That's number one. Secondly, whether a Section 37C distribution from a retirement annuity fund is also permitted to be transferred to a beneficiary fund, notwithstanding the restrictions that the Income Tax Act imposes on retirement annuity funds. That is, that retirement annuity funds may only transfer to another retirement annuity fund. Umbrella funds. So as I explained earlier on, COFI has now introduced this definition of a sub-fund referring to particular participating employers. And the reason for that is, we'd like to believe, following from the case in 2016 with the Old Mutual Super Fund, the FSB Appeal Board, where the appeal board ruled that umbrella funds cannot, in their rules, create separate legal personalities for sub-funds because it's in contravention of the Pension Funds Act. The COFI bill has now tried to, I guess, rectify that by imposing new requirements for umbrella funds. These requirements will have to be complied with by existing umbrella funds within 12 months of COFI being enacted and the section being made effective. One of these is, firstly, the rules of the umbrella fund must provide for the assets, rights, liabilities, and obligations in respect of each participating employer to be maintained separately in each sub-fund. Secondly, the assets and liabilities corresponding to members that are currently employed by a participating employer, pensioners that were formerly employed by that participating employer, as well as their beneficiaries, must be held separately in each sub-fund. So they must be held separately to the sub-fund of another participating employer. So what will happen now is that the umbrella fund will have to ensure compliance by the fund with the Pension Funds Act at sub-fund level. It also means that if a sub-fund is underfunded, surplus assets in another sub-fund in the same umbrella fund cannot be used to make up that shortfall. In addition, and the last requirement is that any provision in the Pension Funds Act that applies to the determination of minimum benefits, minimum individual reserves, minimum pension increases of members, the determination of actuarial surplus, the funding of any shortfall between the assets and liabilities, as well as member and employer surplus accounts, must apply to each sub-fund separately. However, umbrella funds may still maintain accounts at fund level. This goes back and speaks to the fact that the fund will have to ensure compliance by the fund with the Pension Funds Act and COFI at sub-fund level. So commercially sponsored funds. According to National Treasury, the commercially sponsored fund is not a type of fund per se. It's not a pension fund, a provident preservation fund, and so forth. Any type of fund can be a commercially sponsored fund. So for example, an umbrella fund or a beneficiary fund could also be a commercially sponsored fund as long as it has been established by a commercial sponsor. Only a licensed financial institution as defined in the FSR Act may be a commercial sponsor, such as an insurer or an administrator. For instance, if an insurer sets up an umbrella fund, it will be providing administration, consulting, actuarial, and investment management services to the umbrella fund. That umbrella fund would be considered then a commercially sponsored fund. It must be noted, though, that sponsor does not extend to employers, unions, or other entities that establish retirement funds. The wording of the definition, though, of sponsor and commercial sponsor seems to suggest that in order to fall within the ambit of a commercially sponsored fund, there would have to be more than one financial product or one financial service that is provided to the fund. It's not clear, but we're hoping that in the final version of COFI, they will make that clear, whether it has to be more than one or whether one financial product suffices for a fund to be considered a commercially sponsored fund. In addition to the requirements that have been placed on funds, with regards to commercially sponsored funds, Section 27.1 of COFI imposes certain obligations and requirements that the fund must follow. So 27.1 says that a financial institution that provides financial products or financial services to retail financial customers must enter into a written agreement with the financial customer whenever possible and always act within the mandate. Now, how this then extends to commercially sponsored funds is that 27.4 of COFI basically states that members of commercially sponsored funds are treated as retail financial customers. At the end, it says there, all requirements in subsection 1 relating to retail financial customers apply equally in relation to the members of that retirement fund or similar member-based entity. I'd like to believe that this means the agreement that will be entered into will probably be an agreement that is entered into between the sponsor and the fund. It's likely that that will happen rather than it being an agreement with each individual member. In addition, COFI has now established a central unclaimed retirement benefit fund. It has now included this as Section 4D in the Pension Funds Act, and it states that it will be subject to regulation in terms of the Pension Funds Act. When perusing the section that they have now proposed in COFI, it seems to get into more detail about how they will appoint the board members of this particular central unclaimed retirement benefit fund, but it's silent on many aspects. One, it's silent on whether an obligation exists for existing unclaimed benefits funds and other funds with liabilities for the payment of unpaid benefits to transfer their liabilities for those benefits and assets of a corresponding value. There is a recent article, though, where the head of retirement funds at the FSCA seems to allude to the fact that this obligation will exist. However, we are yet to see in the final version of COFI whether they will amend it to include that existing unclaimed benefit funds will have the obligation to transfer their liabilities as well as any other funds that have the liabilities of unclaimed benefit funds. Secondly, it's their tracing protocols aren't clear. There's no information on the tracing efforts that are required by this fund. There is also no clarity on how administration fees, tracing fees, and the like will be dealt with in the face of the prohibition of reducing member benefits. So what COFI has done is that in Section 37A, it has now included subsection 5, and it has stated that an unclaimed benefit may not be reduced for any purpose by the fund. And so it's not clear with that being inserted how administration fees and tracing fees will be accounted for. Lastly, there's no clarity on the investment objectives and protocol of the board of the Central Unclaimed Retirement Benefit Fund. Granted, Regulation 28 will apply to this particular board, but we would like to see whether there are any safeguards for the amount of monies that they will be dealing with, given the fact that the monies referred to here are in the billions of rands. So the impact on the various stakeholders. I saw a question earlier on when Chantal was presenting regarding self-administered funds as to whether they will be regulated, since they haven't been regulated thus far in terms of the Pension Funds Act. What COFI envisages is that self-administered funds will have to be licensed for retirement fund benefit for the benefit administration portion, in addition to being licensed as a retirement fund or as a financial institution. Likewise, any third-party administrator who would have been registered previously under Section 13B will also have to get a license for benefit administration. The view is to repeal the whole of Section 13B because administration is dealt with under the COFI bill, and it sets out the different licensing requirements as well as the responsibilities of such administered funds. We're hoping to see that there will probably be conduct standards that will be published to delineate what it is that is expected of such benefit administrators, in addition to what was previously required under Section 13B. Secondly, COFI has now included public sector retirement funds under the ambit of the legislation. So your GPFs, your TRFs, post office retirement funds will now be included and will be regulated under COFI, which means that they now have to do everything that all the other pension funds are doing. They'll have to comply with COFI, ensure compliance with COFI. Their rules and governing legislation will also have to be amended to align with the PFA and COFI. The bill has provided exemption provisions, but it seems the exemption provisions are to give the these public sector retirement funds enough time to align themselves with the provisions of COFI. Another consequence of them being included will mean that any complaints they receive will then have to go to the pension funds adjudicator, and will also be governed by the Financial Services Tribunal. Lastly, the principal officers. As explained by Chantal, they are now included in the definition of key persons. According to COFI, they will now have a fiduciary duty towards the fund and its members, because there's been so much confusion as to whether principal officers actually owe a fiduciary duty towards the fund. They have now expressly included that in COFI, and they also seem to include some of the requirements of a principal officer, the responsibilities and so forth that are outlined in PF 130. They've now included those into COFI as well. However, the fact that a principal officer now has a fiduciary duty towards the fund and its members does not divest board members of their responsibilities under the Pension Funds Act. Okay. In addition to all of those other changes, there have been changes to some of the sections in the Pension Funds Act. There have been changes to Section 37C, Section 37D, as well as Section 27. I will get into all of those. With regards to Section 37C, they have now included and said that where a fund has successfully traced a dependent, the fund is to make payment to this dependent within 2 months of tracing the dependent. Secondly, within fund living annuities and life annuities, which I think is more of a welcome change, they've now said that a pensioner who receives this and dies in that guaranteed period, that benefit must then be paid to the nominees. So where there are no nominees, it must then be paid into the estate of such member, and if there's no inventory, to the guardian's fund or unclaimed benefit fund. As regards minor dependents, COFI is now included an age for when minor dependents or nominees should be paid the balance of a benefit. And they've said that these minor dependents must be paid either at the age of majority or an agreed age between the fund and such beneficiary, but not exceeding the 21 years of age. With Section 37D of the PFA, what COFI has done is it has now stated that where a member has an outstanding loan, whether it is irrespective of whether it's due or payable, the pension interest is deemed to be reduced by this amount if the housing loan was granted before the divorce order. That's number one. Secondly, the fund cannot give a housing loan to a member if it is aware that a divorce action is pending, unless it gets consent from the spouse, so from the non-member spouse. With regards to maintenance orders, it has requested that arrears maintenance must be paid as a lump sum, and future maintenance, on the other hand, must be paid in monthly payments or annually in advance if the fund cannot make any monthly payments. However, with regards to future maintenance, it is not permitted to make any lump sum payments. Lastly, with Section 37D, it has in effect the retirement savings held in a preservation fund will now be deemed to fall within the scope of a member's pension interest on divorce, despite the fact that the Divorce Act defines the term with reference to the deemed termination of a member's employment by a participating employer, and there are no participating employers in preservation funds. So it has now allowed for a calculation of pension interest in pension preservation and provident preservation funds as if the member has exited. The general amendments that have been made by COFI, the FSCA can now appoint persons to a board, especially in circumstances where a trustee is removed as someone who has been deemed to be not fit and proper. This is according to Section 26(4) of COFI. But the FSCA can also appoint an independent person to a board if it is in the interests of the fund or the members to do so. The FSCA has been given some wide powers regarding this. Financial statements. Funds are to provide the FSCA with their financial statements 4 months after financial year end and not 6 months anymore. Section 26(2) trustees. The persons appointed to the funds can be paid by the fund or the administrator. Section 27(5) and 6 have been included, and they grant the FSCA powers to reinstate the license of a retirement fund which was cancelled with retrospective effect to the date of cancellation if it's satisfied that the fund had not ceased to exist or cancellation was as a result of a genuine error. And then generally, the FSCA can prescribe standards on any matter that is appropriate and necessary for achieving the purposes of Pension Funds Act. And it can also determine administrative and penalty fees in terms of Section 167 of the FSRA, the person by whom the fee must be paid, the manner of payment of the fees, and where necessary, the interest payable on overdue fees. These are quite wide powers. And I say this because we've had a matter before unrelated to pension funds, but related to CISCA, where the FSCA said that the person and his company had breached Section 65 of CISCA, and in the result, they planned to impose a penalty of 250 million rand on the CEO in his personal capacity, and 850 million rand on the company, just for that contravention. So it will be interesting to see the types of administrative and penalty fees that the FSCA will be imposing, given that they've been given this power. And that's it on my end. Chantal will be explaining the next steps.
Thank you, Amina. Okay, so I know there's been a whole host of questions. So do you just mind sharing your screen again with the next steps on there, Amina?
Okay.
Thank you, sorry, because I closed my presentation. So Treasury has indicated that they are wanting to have this bill first thing in 2021. So the initial deadline for comments was the 30th of October. Our industry body, the Institute of Retirement Funds Africa, were granted an extension until the 16th of November. So they're all busy furiously working on collating these submissions that need to go through by the 16th to Treasury on this draft of the bill. In separate discussions where the FSCA has been present, asked them, you know, is this seriously the intent that the bill will go to Parliament in early 2021? And they said, yes, that's the intention. As we know, intents are all well and good. Who knows what's waiting for us in 2021? But the advice I can give is that we need to plan as if it is, well, that it very likely will go into Parliament early next year, but also just to appease everyone or not to create panic. Is as much as this sounds so big and so mammoth, even if COFI is enacted, the authorities have got the power to have transitional effective dates. So it won't be a big bang once it's promulgated. We're now suddenly squarely in the COFI world. There will be transitional periods for certain sections or clauses within the COFI bill. Similarly, there's also, they can also make the effective date of all the consequential amendments to the financial sector laws. They can also have different dates. So not everything that we've spoken about today will all happen in one big go come once the act is, or once the bill is enacted. But also just to bear in mind that they have said that once the effective date of COFI is published or gazetted, all existing financial institutions will have 3 years in which to transition across and apply for their COFI license. Yes, there's a lot of work waiting for all of us. I think we just need to embrace these changes. And I think, you know, it's all good things. So, and also with the conduct standards, that's where the detail is going to be. And just remembering, you know, a conduct standard is also something that under the FSR Act has to go through a consultation process. Industry or impacted people need to be given a chance to submit comments. The FSCA is obliged to issue a response document to all the comments that are submitted. And then it needs to go to Parliament. And only thereafter is it actually effective, and potentially we'll also have transitional dates mentioned in that. So yes, it's a lot to digest, but this is going to be our new world that we are operating within. So I think we can move over to questions now. So Leanne, are you still on the line, or do you want me just to address the questions as I see them in the Q&A box?
Chantal, we have been furiously trying to answer questions. I don't think I've got to all of them, and you guys are welcome to add to them as you know, attendees as well. So please go ahead and add your comments and answers. But I think those 2 questions that I perhaps sent to you on WhatsApp, I think perhaps let's deal with those first. And then I'm going to have to drop off quite soon. So I'm going to hand over to you from now.
Sure. Okay, so the first question was whether insurers also need to be relicensed under COFI. Definitely. Insurers will need to not only have their license granted under the Insurance Act by the Prudential Authority, but all insurers will need a COFI license as well. And then I think the next question was around the PEO's independence and that it's still not clear whether they can be employed by a sponsor or an administrator. So I think in this instance, we know all the debates that have gone on in the industry around Directive 8 and so forth. And I think by them making it now explicit in Section 8 of the Retirement Funds Act that a principal officer does have a fiduciary duty, I think it's going to be clear that a principal officer can't be employed by a sponsor or by a service provider of that fund. Not too sure if you want to add anything to that, Leanne.
No, I don't, Chantal. I think that's all good. And perhaps the other issue that we've received a lot of comment on relates to, firstly, to umbrella funds. So, there are the new requirements in the Pension Funds Act around separating out sub-funds. And the comment I made is that, it doesn't go so far as to say, to give you specifics. So I suspect that a conduct standard will be issued around those specific provisions, which talk about things like bank accounts, etc. Because, at this stage, we don't know the extent to which, for example, assets need to be separated and at what level. Does it need, take, for example, one of my clients raised with me, if an umbrella fund is a pooled investment portfolio, to what extent does separation for sub-fund need to happen at that level, or is it just an understanding at retirement fund level? Because it actually talks about the financial institution itself having that, putting that in place, which is the fund, as opposed to the investment manager. With respect to bank accounts, as an example, again, it's not specified in those provisions. So I expect that there will have to be a conduct standard around this, because I think that those provisions related to umbrella funds are especially not clear. I, for one, do not understand exactly what is meant by that. I don't know if you have got any comments around that.
No, I agree with you, Leanne. I think, the challenge we find ourselves currently in is that, so much is going to be dealt or addressed through conduct standards. And until you actually know the thinking or see the wording of the conduct standard, it's so difficult to be clear on exactly what the expectation is going to be. So we'll be busy for a very, very long time around all of this.
Yeah. Amina, please feel free to add your comments as you have them. I know you've been addressing questions in the chat as well. Perhaps the other thing that has been raised quite a lot in the chat group is around Section 37C amendments. So what I can tell you is that, for example, the Institute of Retirement Funds Africa, they've submitted a large comment on that specific section, not only on what is in there, so what is in the amendment, but also what is not there. Okay, so there are a number of issues that we'd like to see clarified with respect to 37C, and we've included all of those issues in the submission. So, the idea is to try and make 37C more practical and less litigious, so that trustees have an easier time actually applying it and everybody understands how it should be applied. So there is quite a lot of comment going through on 37C, particularly, the one issue that was added in the comments and the chat was around that 2-month period. The 2-month period in relation to where you have found, so where you have dependents and you're now paying out to your dependents. So that period's been changed from 12 months to 2 months. We don't know how that 2 months is going to be applied. So for example, does the 2-month apply to the whole period? So while you're investigating, while you're allocating, while you're paying, etc. Or is that 2-month only intended to apply to the payment period? So once you've done all that and you've made your allocation, you then have 2 months to pay. We don't know because the wording is not clear. Plus, obviously, a lot of people are recognizing the issue of, well, if you have to pay within 2 months of the dependent being traced, what about if you haven't yet traced the other dependents? Usually what a fund does is it wants all its dependents and then it'll make an allocation amongst those dependents. Also, what does traced mean? So for example, some of the commentary has been around, we'll replace the word traced with identify and find, because that covers, you know, the actual identification itself of the dependent and then the payment, because tracing has sort of a kind of an understood meaning to it, and it's not defined. So there's lots and lots of commentary around that particular part of 37C, the whole of 37C, as well as 37D. So yeah, I don't know if you guys have other comments around that as well.
Just to add, I mean, all the work the industry did on 37C, I think it was this time last year, where the FECA asked collectively through the PLA, the RFA, and BATSETA to submit the industry's challenges with 37C. So I think that good work is now also going to be sent through again to Treasury as part of the submission on the amendments to 37C.
Yeah, that's right. Okay. Okay. So I think that those were the main questions we wanted to answer, and a lot of them have been answered already. So I think it just remains for me to say thank you so much to the panelists, to Chantal and to Amina. This is all new stuff, so it's very brave of you to come on and to answer questions and to present to us. So thank you so much. But then thank you also to our attendees. It was so great to get all those questions from you. Thank you so much for your participation. We really appreciate that. And as always, we appreciate you attending our webinar. So thank you so much. Just in case you didn't hear it right at the beginning, please note that we will be providing the slides to all attendees after the webinar. We'll make a decision about how and if we make the recording available. I just need to speak to Chantal and Amina about that because it's their personal information. And then we will let you know. And then thank you also to Andrew. So that's Andrew, who you can see on screen now. Thank you so much for arranging the webinar and, as always, you know, arranging everything around it as well. Andrew has said that we will be applying for CPD points, and if we are granted those for the webinar, then we will send you those as well. So thank you so much. Andrew, is there anything else you'd like to add?
No, just thanks everybody for participating. Amazing, the technology, given that I was mobile at the time this all started, and kept it going on my cell phone while I was driving through the mountains.
Thank you so much. And yeah, thanks very much for making sure everything ran smoothly. Thanks, guys, and we'll see you again at our next webinar.
Thank you, Leanne. Thanks, Andrew.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.